Today is Sunday, March 16th, 2025, and this is episode 300 of the Defensive Security Podcast. My name is Jerry Bell, and joining me today, as always, is Mr. Andrew Callett.
Good evening, Mr. Bell. How are you, sir?
I'm awesome. How are you doing?
I'm good. I think we should just skip 300 and go straight to 301 just to mess with all of our OCD listeners.
Yeah, we were debating that. I'll flip a coin after we're done recording.
But hey, 300, that's pretty impressive.
It is. Congratulations.
Indeed. With a few random gaps in there, right? We had some life events get in the way.
But we're back.
We're
back in the saddle.
It's true.
By the way, we didn't have a chance to talk about it, but I'm not sure about next week's schedule because I've got a thing at a place that will take all weekends.
You're finally getting indicted.
Well, I have to serve my time over the weekends.
It's kind of them to give you the weeks out to take care of Thor and your grandkittens,
which there's more of every time I turn around.
I saw your post on It Was Like That Exchange that you have a new grandkitten.
I do. All right. So before we get started, a reminder that the thoughts and opinions we express are ours and not those of our employers. However, they could be. And also a shout out to our Patreon donors. Thank you so much. Your contributions are sincerely welcomed.
Absolutely. Thank you, guys.
Really helping us. So thank you. And then getting into our stories. The first one comes from VentureBeat. And the title here is 51 Seconds to Breach, How CISOs Are Countering AI-Driven, Lightning-Fast, Deepfake, Phishing, and Social Engineering Attacks. I felt like that title could have been half as long. So a lot of this story comes from an interview with some folks at CrowdStrike. And it really talks about how in CrowdStrike's most recent global threat report, they describe how the shortest breakout time, so the time from initial compromise to lateral movement, was 51 seconds, so sub 1 minute. And, and it's a really stark contrast from discussions that we've had in the past and, kind of the normal tracking of mean time to detection and whatnot being on the order of days, because in a lot of instances, we've been used to these attacks playing out over the course of days, weeks, months, and sometimes even years. But now we're starting to see that really being pulled in. And by the way, I think there's an over attribution in this to AI. I would kind of walk that back a little bit, at least for me, and say more like automation and orchestration. I think AI is probably a little.
It may be like well-honed playbooks.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So I don't think they're turning an AI bot loose once they get into your network. I think they perhaps are using AI to help build those playbooks. I could certainly see that and help define techniques to move laterally, but I think that's kind of, at least at this point, where it stops.
But Jerry, you can't get any media attention or funding unless you use the word AI.
It's true. It's so true. There were some interesting data points in here that I thought were worth talking about. One of which was that voice phishing. I'm not going to say the V word anymore because I just hate it. It grates on me. Went up by 442% in 2024 over 2023. And I think that's a large part because of some of the deep fake type, because I suspect there's some blending of deep fake attacks with this voice-based phishing. But we've seen this kind of being perpetuated in a bunch of different ways. Like we've seen instances where attackers are overloading victims with spam and then calling them up. Technically, that's voice-based phishing, right? And so on and so forth. So I think that it's being again used as an attribute in a perhaps larger attacks. I'm not surprised. I think that the subtext in this article is that there's less reliance on malware as a means of intrusion and lateral movement and more on things like social engineering and actual credential theft because companies are becoming a lot more sophisticated in their ability to detect and prevent.
Yeah, I would agree. It's interesting too, the 442% increase. We don't have raw numbers, so it could have been a very small number in previous years. Also, I think maybe awareness is growing and people are getting better at reporting them. But either way, voice based phishing with, I'm assuming, some sort of voice cloning or deep fake, uh, certainly getting scary. It's getting very cheap. It's getting very effective. And it's just going to keep getting better. So I can see this absolutely as a problem. Although I still think the fundamental solution is probably the same, which is don't trust known voices and faces as an authenticator. Have a process, have a methodology that still insists on it doesn't matter if that person you're talking to is or is not that person. They still need to go through the proper process to do something, whether it's sensitive, whether it's reset a password or transfer $5 million to Jerry's offshore bank account, whatever it is, it shouldn't be done based purely on a request. It has to go through some sort of process that hopefully would have some sort of authentication multi-factor that is much harder to spoof.
For this article, they interview the CISO of a oil company, and they ask this person for some advice, and uh, he had 3 points of advice. One was that zero trust is mandatory, and I will say, like, that is the platitude of all platitude, right? It's kind of like you should use cloud or you should use strong authentication. It means different things to different people. And some companies will sell you their zero trust box, and others will parse every word out of the NIST zero trust guidance. Still, others will say, well, zero trust just means that I don't trust the network that it's on, and therefore I can just stick it on the internet. I don't need a firewall anymore. And everywhere in between. And so one of the challenges I see with this guidance is that there isn't at least as far as I can see, a really good consensus on what it means.
To me, I agree, but if it's very situational, but the way I look at it, at least in general, is that there's no inherent trust between systems, that all trusted communication must be authenticated in some positive way. So just because you're on an employee's machine, their workstation, there's no automatic trust granted to other machines because you're present on that device. Is one of the ways I look at it. It also means I have zero trust for most firewalls as of late.
You should.
Coming from someone who worked for 5 years for a leading software firewall manufacturer, that's kind of ironic, but we've had that's just a riff on how many of them have had remote code exploit and other vulnerabilities as of late. That's all.
Yeah. I think that's a very good definition. But the takeaway is, it is intuitive that this is the right advice. What's not intuitive is that we all have perhaps slightly different interpretations of what that means, and therefore, like, I think we would do well to make sure that we're thinking about it properly.
Yeah, that's true.
His second bit of advice was to shut down in a very rapid way attacks against credentials. So this basically means like have the ability to revoke identities almost immediately. They're talking about again revoking access rather than just rotating passwords and then going back after the fact and reactivating it. And I think that's, by the way, in my experience, that's actually pretty good advice because in the context of an incident, you don't necessarily know how that password was compromised. And therefore, if you change the password and provide it back to the employee, you don't really have a level of confidence that it's not going back to the adversary.
Right. And also, they mentioned revoking session tokens or shutting down open
Yes.
sessions at that
Yes.
same moment, which I think is a rarely discussed but important aspect. Like you could reset a password, but if that doesn't also close open sessions, it doesn't matter if the bad actor's already got a session open.
So I completely agree with that. I think one of the challenges I've had with this, in my experience is the ease with which you can do that is variable based on the technology
Oh,
that you're
yeah.
using.
Yeah. And it could be all over the map in the same organization, depending on, are you using SSO? How well integrated is that SSO? There's a ton of variables. You're right. But sometimes just resetting a password most of the time doesn't reset existing open connections. So I think the key thing there for me is test it. Don't make an assumption. Understand when someone resets a password, does it close out existing connections and ask for that new password? Or do you retain that session, whether it's through a token, a cookie, whatever it may be, and can continue on your merry way until it eventually times out or expires?
Good advice. The third bit of advice this person had um, was to focus on eliminating single points of failure, and so by that they're really talking about uh, limiting the amount of damage a single person can do. And I'll tell you, when I read this, I was trying to envision what this person had in mind when they wrote this. So the text basically says, be sure to have a separation of duties. Ensure no one person or service account can reset a password, multi-factor access, and bypass conditional access. Now, it took me a minute to realize what they're really saying is a person, like the same person, shouldn't be able to do all of those three things at the same time. That it was a little. Now, maybe it's just me because I was on beach time for a while. But I think that's actually a very very good point, right? Is you have a help desk person become compromised, whether it's the person themselves or their access or their computer or what have you. If they have the ability to effectively, hijack other accounts by changing passwords, changing or disabling multi-factor authentication and other aspects of your zero trust process, that's a bad thing. And so the point there is you should be segmenting that so that it would take an adversary would have to compromise multiple people in order to accomplish that kind of objective. That's
Sure.
a good idea. I think it starts to break down in smaller organizations though. That's I think one of the challenges, broadly speaking, a lot of this guidance, a lot of all guidance in the industry has is that like it works great if you have an IT team of hundreds and a security team of dozens or hundreds. But what if you have like a help desk person?
So you need to hire somebody with multiple personalities, I think.
That's the key.
Look, I'm a problem solver, man.
Yeah. Wow. So then they go on to talk about how important it is to have, again, a framework for zero trust. And they recommend that you refer back to the NIST standard for zero trust, which I think is a good read. Again, coming back to the challenge, a lot of the technology that most organizations have are going to be difficult to map in. So it might be a great idea, but I think you're going to have a lot of overhang where becomes very difficult, and then you have to figure out how you deal with that overhang as you're continuing to deploy your strategy.
And how do you deal with rapid change and iteration and new stuff? Like if you're in a very static, stable environment, it's sometimes easier. But if you've got different departments bringing in new software all the time that doesn't necessarily align, and they're innovating quickly, or they're developing things in house, that becomes an interesting challenge too. Like how do you deal with that rapid change that we're all seeing right now, while still trying to drive some level of integration with your security tooling to achieve some of these automated goals? I don't have easy
That's
solves there.
It's a good point. I'll go further and say I think a lot of the new and novel technologies and SaaS services and whatnot, AI tools, typically aren't very mature, and so may not slot well into such a strategy. And so then you're kind of back at the point of what's more important.
Yeah, or they offer like full SSO integration at a higher tier cost wise, and your marketing department went out and bought the SaaS tool but didn't want to pay for that extra tier, and now you're at an impasse, right? So those sorts of things happen. I'm
And the
not saying
marketing
it's not good or
department's happy. They're happy to get the higher tier, but you as the security team
you
have
have
to
to
pay
pay
for
for
it.
it. Yeah. So I'm not trying to discount the validity of the advice, just the real world challenge you have in affecting this advice.
Yeah, I think that me the challenge is figuring out how to operate in an imperfect world, right? In a perfect world, we would have a very robust zero trust, for in the real definition implemented and operated. But the reality is that's we don't none of us have ideal environment.
Yeah. I mean, the other
And so
approach, sorry, go ahead.
no, go ahead.
I mean, the other thing that occurs to me as we're talking about this is not everything in your environment also has to be treated with the same level of scrutiny and security. You can tier them in terms of criticality, sensitivity, impact, kind of like a DR assessment. And, for your tier 0 and tier 1 and tier 2 stuff, they may have very different requirements based on how critical and sensitive that area may be. And then you can have more innovation at the edges where it's not as critical. But for the stuff that's your main core data set for whatever, maybe you have a more stringent set of requirements that are enforced more heavily, but that will cause slower, more expensive innovation, but it's your most sensitive areas. Maybe one potential approach.
And if you're going to do that, I would say make sure that you're thinking about segmentation properly, because then your weak spot becomes the Achilles heel of your uber secure environment.
Now, I don't want to point out that you're an old white guy from the South, talking about segregation.
My goodness.
Oh, you said
I
segmentation.
did say
Oh,
that
my apologies.
not micro segregation.
We're going to get some hate mail on that one. Sorry, carry on.
What won't it will just blend into all the spam. Like,
Of all the people trying to optimize our YouTube presence.
oh my god, we apparently have the worst YouTube channel based on the spam we get. We have the worst YouTube channel that was ever put out.
Clearly.
The next bit of advice was related to adopting AI for your security operation. And so I'm sure nobody has anything to sell on this front, but I think it's at the realistic point that in a world where the dwell time is measured in minutes, it's not really feasible to rely on humans to make manual correlations between things. So I think we're kind of there, but I go back to the same point that how many organizations have the sophistication and capability to actually do that? Like I mean, I'm
And
sure the desire's there.
yeah, let's say you have the capability. Is your operations team on board with something automatically containing or blocking something that could potentially disrupt production? And how do you handle that? And what if it happens at 2 in the morning and you're not a 24/7 shop?
Yeah, you get it in the morning after coffee.
Well, I mean, this goes back to maybe a tiering aspect where things that are critical customer, like let's say you're operating a SaaS tool or a bank or whatever, and maybe the critical functions aren't able to be automatically or AI disabled, but maybe user accounts for individuals are, because that's containing a small, less disruptive impact if AI were to shut off an individual user's account as opposed to maybe some critical service account between a database and a website.
Yeah, so I mean, it goes back to risk management, the potential damage that your automation could do. But I think over time, we're clearly headed in a direction where this is going to be the world, right? And so like we can kick our feet and shake our fist at the sky and say like, no, we won't go. But look, over time, this is coming. It's the tide is coming in. And by the way, it's probably never going to go out. And so I think the leaders here are going to be those that help figure this out for your organization. But I would also say that a lot of this stuff is going to necessarily be very specific to your organization because the structure that you have, the technology stack you have is all going to be fairly unique to you. And there's certainly going to be some like breathtakingly expensive AI solutions that companies will offer you. But like everything, I would just caution you to figure out like how big is the bus of consultants that has to come along with that thing that you're trying to find.
Jerry will help you out for a mere $1,000 an hour.
Oh, are we discounting it now?
Look, yeah, listener discount.
Okay.
If you call within the next 5 minutes
50% off.
at 1-800 need Jerry, and we'll give you a little discount.
All right.
Operators
I
are
think
standing by.
I think we kicked that one. The next story comes from the Register, and the title here is How Not to F Up Your Security Incident Response. I loved this one.
I could have used this 20 years ago in my career, but
So this is in large part based on an interview with Jake Williams, who is, I think, very well known in the industry. And one of this, by the way, is something that I have seen. Look, I've been involved in countless incidents, both having caused them and having investigated them.
Took my joke.
I wanted to cut it off.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I knew we were going to go there. And it, by the way, it is a very difficult, especially after you're look. We're all technologists at heart, right? And so going into an incident, we typically have a notion of what happened. And one of the overarching points that Jake is making in this article is trying to highlight is that's the wrong way to approach an incident investigation. You need to allow the investigation to lead you where it takes you rather than starting with a preordained expectation of what happened and then looking for evidence that supports your hypothesis. And he points out as an example a situation where an incident he was involved with involved several servers. And one of the servers happened to be internet facing. And so the company's security team assumed that the internet facing server was the thing that was initially attacked. It was the source of the intrusion. And so they spent an inordinate amount of time investigating, looking for something on that system. And they found something, but in the end, upon second look, that was actually a subsequent victim in the compromise. That was not patient zero. It was something that was hacked after one of the other systems had been compromised, but they didn't realize that because they had this kind of preordained notion that like that was the system. That was what happened. This system was compromised. Let's go figure out how that compromise happened. And the problem with that is if you don't actually figure out what happened, you don't really know how the bad guys got in, what method they used to compromise you. And if you don't know that, you can't actually do a competent job of making sure it doesn't happen again. And I would also say it's not really clearly articulated this directly in the article, but I would go further and say that if you're approaching your investigation in that manner, you're probably not being thorough enough to figure out all the places that the bad guys wandered, and you're probably going to be blind to something that happened. And so it's really important that you have a more methodical approach to incident management. This, by the way, is why incident response teams make the big bucks.
Yep.
This is not easy work. It is not easy work. But in this article, they give you some pretty good pointers. I learned this stuff. I didn't have the luxury of going to a class or anything like that. I learned kind of on the job. The stuff that's listed in this article is absolutely true. The importance of building a timeline and so on. Like it is really important that you have a very methodical approach, that you capture artifacts, that I guess it depends on, how big your environment is, what you hope to accomplish. Like maybe it's simpler just to recycle the whole thing and you don't actually care how bad the compromise is because you would waste more money in incident response than you would lose based on knowing the actual cost. So, but even there, you don't know what the initial compromise method was, and therefore you don't know that you've prevented it from happening.
Yeah, there's a lot of good advice in here. One thing that there's a subtext of here that I don't think is really called out is also some sort of centralized incident commander type structure that is coordinating and dictating response, correlation of evidence. Like if you've got a lot of people running in 1,000 different directions thinking they're helping, they're going to make things worse. So some sort of centralized run response, I think, is important. The other thing that isn't, in addition to all these other things that I don't think without that you can't really hit. The other thing that I don't mention a ton in here that I think is important to me is pre-incident setup matters a lot. Do you have the log evidence you need? Do you have the EDR evidence you need? If you're coming in, especially if you're hiring an outside firm to come in and do incident response, they're very beholden on what evidence they can look at. I think you've got to plan for that sort of incident ahead of time by making sure you're gathering and preserving and saving all of the evidence that might be necessary in an incident.
It's a really good point. And the ability for you to track back to patient zero and to figure out all of the places that the adversary wandered in your network is a direct function on the logs and artifacts that you have available to you. If you don't have that stuff available to you, you may just not be able to get there. And so that's a tough thing. And so keeping things like firewall logs, even internal firewall logs, and in particular like accepts, like a lot of companies or a lot of organizations will log denies. But if you don't log accepts, you might not have the information to know which systems were talking to which other systems, which becomes exceptionally important in the context of an investigation.
Those logs get expensive, though.
Disks, I mean, this space is pretty cheap these days. That's
Depends on the cloud vendor that you might be using, but sure.
well, that's. I will also say I have in the past worked in a model where, to your point about the incident commander, we had what I'll describe as project managers, and I don't mean that in like the pejorative sense of a of a project manager. I mean people who were competent incident commanders that basically would manage an incident response as if it were a project. And so they would be coordinating all of the activities. They would be acting as a central clearinghouse, making sure that documentation was updated, that timelines were populated, that people weren't stepping on each other, that people knew when it was okay and not okay to do things like reimage systems and that sort of stuff. So I think it's a great point because unless you're a super small shop in the context of an incident, it's chaos, especially because you have and this I know this is not described in here. Like this, I know this. Anybody who's worked in incident response knows this. What happens after there's an incident? Like you have 17 executives calling you every 10 minutes. What's going on? Where are we at? How can I help? How can I help? I want to help.
And not just you,
And
they're calling other people in other departments and
right,
perhaps asking for things to be done on their own.
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so uh, it is exceptionally important, in my experience, to also have someone who can run interference for the teams who are actually doing the incident response work. And that was the other thing that we found
Yeah.
those project managers to be helpful.
What I've done sometimes is, assuming I'm in a Zoom environment, I'll have a Zoom room with the engineers working the incident, and then I'll have another Zoom room with the executives, and I'll go back and forth. And like every 10 minutes, go give an update to the executives and take their good ideas and bring them back, right? Sometimes. Because we do executives have good idea fairies sitting on their shoulders during an incident.
They really do. By the way, I think that in general, because I was one. Like, I mean, I can't throw too many rocks. Um, you feel powerless, right? Like you have this responsibility to the organization, and you know that something bad is going on, and you feel powerless, and so you genuinely want to help, but oftentimes in the process of doing that, you're making it worse. You're not actually helping. And so I think one of the other recommendations in this and other articles is making sure that you have a playbook. The first time that you've thought about incident response isn't when the incident is happening. And part of that, in my experience, is figuring out how to harness the energy of your executive team. And one of the obvious ways to me is helping them, getting them to help with aligning resources. Because a lot of times in these incidents, you have to coordinate with other teams. You have to change the priorities of some other part of the organization. Let's say there's a product development team that needs to go do something. Well, they've got a delivery that's due at the end of the month. So like they don't want to go work on your incident. So have in your mind ways that you can leverage their positive energy, let's assume good intent, to help what you're trying to accomplish. Because otherwise they are just going to keep you on the phone. Let's be clear. And so know how you're going to use them. My advice.
I think that's brilliant advice.
They talk a little bit about some of the complexities that come along with ransomware. And I think this is an interesting case because I have seen firsthand. Again, we've talked about this in the past, not with my organization, but with others who, or subcontractors or what have you, that had been ransomwared. And especially in smaller shops, they lose everything. They lose their logs, they lose everything. All of their artifacts, all of everything is so that's obviously a big challenge. But the reality is, that's something that at the time of the attack, it's too late. Like these are things that you have to um, plan for and prepare for ahead of time. Like making sure that you're not storing your logs in the same kind of logical domain as the rest of your environment, so that if you do get a ransomware attack, all of your logs and whatnot are not wiped at the same time. And we saw this. This is something that happens a lot. There are ransomware actors who have a very well functioning playbook to attack VMware. We talked a little bit about this on the last episode. And a lot, especially smaller organizations, for very valid reasons, will set up like two or three largish servers and run their entire shop off of that. The entire their entire IT infrastructure, other than workstations, is on this, or maybe there's some component of this up in the cloud. But when those three servers are completely ransomware, they don't have anything anywhere else. Like that is it. And then they have really limited ability to figure out what happened. No matter how much money they're willing to spend with a Mandiant or some competent investigator, like there's just nothing to investigate. It's
Right.
gone.
Right. Yeah. And even if, one last thing I'll say on this is, let's say the host isn't ransomware, but it's compromised. How much do you trust the logs that are retained solely on that host? You really usually have to treat them with suspicion. So it's about getting those logs off board as they are written to someplace safe before the incident.
Yes. Really easy to say and difficult to do. And
Hard to
again, I
do.
think it's a function of like the ease with which you can do it is a function of the sophistication and maturity of your organization. Not every company can afford that. So but it's different going into it with your eyes opening, but in making a conscious decision that look, we can't afford it, then rather than the alternative, you get ransomware and you have the CEO of your company wagging his finger at you over your desk, and you have to say, well, we don't have anything. There's nothing
Yeah.
left. All right. Next story comes from SC Media. The title here is 95% of data breaches involve human error, report reveals. So this is a very multi-personality article that flip-flops between a report from Mimecast, which I did not realize there was a whole video service for mimes, but that's cool. And then also the Know Before, the people who hired the North Korean. That's how they'll always be to me now.
Interestingly, the Mimecast service does have closed captioning.
All right.
Why do they let us even put out a podcast? Who let us do this? Terrible idea.
So there were a couple of interesting data points in the two different reports here that I thought were worth talking about. One was that there's a 43% increase in issues related to employee mistakes year to year, which was just
Mistakes is a strong term when they're a victim of social engineering, but I digress. Carry on.
Yeah. Now, by the way, that what they're comparing and contrasting incidents that result from the actions of a person from those that are like a vulnerability being exploited.
Yeah, makes
But
sense.
one
Yeah.
of the challenges I have is like, okay, so if I forget to apply a patch,
Mm-hmm.
is that a mistake or not?
Well, we'll discuss it on your next review.
So and then if it's code that you wrote in house that's exploited, well, that vulnerability was the result of a mistake.
Right.
So I guess what I'm trying to say is at some point, like you can kind of distill it all out to it's all human. I could argue to some extent all of them have a human mistake at their core.
Yeah, I guess the question is a, for lack of a better term, acceptable mistake that the average person would make, or is it something that implies negligence or some other, what would the normal, standard person do in that circumstance? Is that a mistake or not? So yes, you could always drill it back to, unless it was a machine written piece of AI code that had a vulnerability that was exploited, there's a human somewhere that in hindsight you could say made a mistake. The question is that mistake reasonable to have made?
I think in the context of this though, they're highlighting falling for phishing in all of its friends. I'm not going to say the V word. Deep fakes and business email compromises and stuff like that. I think that's what I think they're holding all of that in that employee mistakes basket, as opposed to somebody makes a bad technology decision. I don't think that's what they're really talking about here. They do talk about how there's an increasing concern around collaboration tools, which I thought was interesting in the context of what we've talked about multiple times now, where adversaries are using like Teams and Slack to contact victim employees directly rather than calling them up over the phone. And when you pair that to other types of attacks, like we've seen with the flurry of spam, and then suddenly you're contacted by someone who purports to be from the help desk. So I think that there is certainly a lot more to go here. It's very interesting to me that so many organizations seem to be willing to expose their internal tools, internal collaboration tools to the outside to let people come in unsolicited that are not part of their organization. And this
It
is,
doesn't
by the
have
way, this is not like somebody's compromised an account. Like
right.
they
It's a
just,
setting.
yeah, it's a setting.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be that way though. Like I know Slack better than I know Teams, and Slack you very well can say, hey, unless you're a part of this organization, you don't get to be a full member. And then people can ask for third parties to join, and maybe just a single channel, and they're labeled as external. So I don't know about Teams, but I feel like from the reporting I've read, a Team seems to be a little more opaque. It's a bit more open than Slack appears to be in this sense. The other thing that occurs to me is nobody's getting exploited on Lotus Notes. So maybe you guys are onto something.
Nobody is, or same time, yeah. Nobody's getting
Right.
exploited on those things.
And those are collaboration tools. Sort of.
The challenge, as I understand it with Teams, is that your designator is basically the email address that you have. And so one of the challenges with Teams is that Microsoft allows you to create subdomains on Microsoft.com. So like you can register like, Jerry's cool subdomain dot on Microsoft.com. And then I can, if you allow it, I can contact your users. And because I have that on Microsoft.com as the root of my email address, especially if I'm clever at picking what my subdomain is, like obviously it wouldn't be available, but if you pick like helpdesk dot on Microsoft.com, it might look legitimate to one of your employees who's not paying close attention. And so that's been one of the big challenges with Teams. So I think you're right. It is an opaqueness problem. There was another interesting dichotomy I picked up in here, and one of them was that 95% of people they surveyed said that they expect email-based security issues to increase 2025. But over half of the respondents said that they have enough money for email security. I thought that was an interesting. They weren't in the same paragraph, but they were in the same report.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting thing. Like on the one hand, I see this problem getting way worse, but on the other hand, I've got everything I need to keep the problem under control.
Yeah.
I guess is what they're saying.
I guess they're assuming their email security tooling that they have in place will adapt appropriately.
It's Proofpoint. Like I just bought Proofpoint. What else do I need? It's all good.
This episode not sponsored by Proofpoint.
All good. What more could you need? Um, the next data point was that 8% of employees are responsible for 80% of incidents. Now, as an executive, you know where my head went.
Who to blame?
How do I get rid of those 8%?
The problem is those 8% are the executives. It's an interesting stat, and it sort of feeds into something you and I fought a lot on the show against, which is, this concept of people who are victims of social engineering are just morally, ethically, or intellectually deficient, which a lot of people believe and still believe and are probably yelling at their podcast playing device because saying, darn right they are. There's probably a lot of other underlying correlation and reasons that 8% is responsible. Is it the type of work they do? It just implies that a small portion of your environment is gullible, and therefore if you just train them enough, you can make that go away. I don't think it's that simple.
So I would say that I'm not gonna dismiss the possibility that there are people out there who are just really bad at decision making and they will click on everything. I'm not going to dismiss that. I mean, I remember a long time ago when I implemented web filtering, people would come to me and ask to have their astrology site. And so like I'm not going to dismiss that that's a possibility, but I have a feeling that the majority are people who are in positions that are more apt, like you're exposed to more types of work where you have to make decisions that is prone to that problem. Like if you're an HR person, let's just say this, you're a recruiter, you are probably going to you're probably going to open more malicious attachments than anybody else, right? That's just the nature of your job.
Especially if Jupiter is rising in your chakras. I don't even know if I said that accurately.
I don't know, but it sounded good. Sounded amazing.
Without that astrology forecast for that employee, they don't know when to not click. One of the things from the astrology site could have said, be cautious of links from third parties this week. And you denied them that.
I'm having regret now. I probably... Ouch. I've got to go rethink my life. Anyway, there was the next point was that there's a wide disparity in people who believe they have the ability to detect and avoid being a victim of a phishing attack based on which country they're from.
That I found fascinating.
Very interesting. And they use, as an example, people in France report a very low level of confidence in their ability to detect phishing attack, whereas people in South Africa are the most confident in their ability. Something like 91% of people in South Africa say that they're confident they could detect an attack. But at the same time, they're also the most likely to fall victim to a phishing attack at 68%. And so the point there was, and this is something we've talked about quite a bit in the past, that a lot of our security awareness programs are designed to help employees detect and avoid falling victim to phishing attacks. But the reality is that we can only do so much. And most of the time we have, narrow constraints on that and that are reasonable. Like you can't send out a uh, phishing email. You shouldn't, at least, that says, "Hey, click here for your company bonus." Or as an example. But these are the kinds of attacks that an actual bad guy would come up with. They don't have those kinds of constraints. And so on the one hand, you have these kind of draconian IT and IT security people coming up with these god awful phishing simulation lures that catch people and are the subject of ridicule on Reddit. But on the other hand, we don't have the ability to cover all of the bases that people are going to actually see in real life. And therefore, when people finish that training, I think they walk away feeling like they have a handle on it, but the reality is I don't think they do, because it's evolving at such a pace.
Yeah.
With AI, deep fakes and whatnot.
I also got to think, I'm very curious about, so France, 32% felt confident, South Africa, 91%. I really wonder what the sociological reasoning is behind that. Is it, some sort of, because different cultures have different social identities and different, like Americans, by and large, were known to be very self-reliant and resilient and independent and, that sort of thing. So I wonder, and I have no idea, but I'm curious, what goes into cultural makeup of a typical South African versus the cultural makeup of a typical French person, Frenchy Frenchman, that causes that difference in almost like confidence in, I'm grasping here, but something along the lines of like their confidence in their ability to spot a scam, or their confidence in themselves, or their confidence in their own intelligence, or something. And one thing, just as a quick aside, I remember in the 80s, we were kicking off globalism. We used to do a lot of training in corporate America about different countries' cultures in business and how to interact with them. It seems like we've stopped most of that. Like, you don't hear about that anymore. But I think it matters. Like, people have very, very, very different cultures, and they're not better, worse. They're just different. And if you don't understand them, you can't as effectively communicate. And I wonder if this is one of those things where I really am curious what it is about the French that's different than the South Africans that causes this stat to occur. But anyway,
It's a
just
good
I
question.
digress.
It's a really good question. Or I'm sure there's some study that would explain it.
And to just follow up on your one point, I think the key is the limitations of our phishing training go back to, also, we have often said that anyone can be phished with a sufficiently advanced phishing attack. So it's up to us as defenders to have technological controls that person being a victim of a phishing attack, a successful victim, isn't fatal to the company.
Yes, there were a couple of other takeaways in here. I'm going to get on to the next one, but um, one was that email-based phishing is still the most common type of scam that people will fall for. Which, given everything else, deep fakes and all the totality of everything else, it's still email that is dominant. And the other is that uh, the rise of AI enabled phishing attacks are much more effective than those that are just um, perpetuated by people. And so that doesn't surprise me, because the AI has the opportunity to go and find information about the culture of a company, and and you can kind of refine the wording, tailor it to the audience, I think in a way that people have a hard time doing unless you're intimately familiar with your target
I can tell you what I am intimately familiar with.
and imagine what you say.
Go on, carry
All
on.
right.
That's all.
So the next story comes from Dark Reading, and the title here is Remote Access Infrastructure Remains Riskiest Corp Attack Service.
Shocker.
Shocker. So look, I've made no secret that I'm on a crusade to get people to take their firewall management control panels off of the breaking internet. And this report here talks about how most breaches are these days being uh, either, as by the way, this is as reported by a cyber insurance company. 45% of insurance claims resulting from a breach happen as a result of VPN appliances being the initial point of intrusion. And
That's
23%,
that's
crazy.
wild to me.
And 23% are from RDP. The only surprise I have there is that RDP was so low. I'm a little surprised that it isn't higher, but it
Agreed.
makes sense.
I mean, we hear about RDP password attacks all the time. Far more than I think we hear about VPN appliance issues. Now, mind you, we've had a rash of a couple of well-known VPN appliance vendors have big problems lately. So I wonder if this is a weird statistical blip or
Well,
if
I
that's
so I
consistent.
think yeah, I think they're putting two different things into the VPN appliance category there. One is actually entering the business end of the VPN. So things like credentials theft or brute forcing or password spraying. And then the other one is via management consoles. And they're kind of conflating at different points in the article. They're kind of conflate those two concepts. Certainly, they're in this report that they are interviewing somebody from this company called Coalition, who is a cyber insurance provider. And one of the points they make is that if you want to sign up for cyber insurance policy with them, one of the things they do is try to figure out if you have any of these exposed management panels on the internet. And I think certainly firewalls and VPN appliances are just one of many different types. But if they say that you if you have one of those, you have to get rid of it before you can be insured, which doesn't surprise me. And then they go further and say, for RDP, they say RDP should, like management panels, just not be exposed to the internet. Like they should just not be there. There's other technologies like they try to aggregate remote access, remote desktop into more of a service architecture. Those should not be accessible to the internet either, no matter what. They should be behind a VPN or otherwise limited to an expected range of sources. But then again, like that kind of flies in the face of the whole zero trust that we just talked about. But in any event, I think we're talking more pragmatism here at the moment. And then they for VPNs, the recommendation is, and I would say further, the requirement is that you use multi-factor authentication so that you're not susceptible to the credential theft, password spraying, that sort of thing. But I would actually go further and say, in the context of a business, most of the VPN, unless you're doing something really on the cheap, most of the technologies have the ability to do not only a user-based authentication but a host-based authentication, so that you're only allowing VPN connections from a workstation that you recognize that is registered with your management infrastructure and is running your malware, anti-malware stuff, CrowdStrike, whatever magic stuff you're using. A lot of it now can do health checks to make sure all that stuff is working. But minimally, I would say making sure that you you can strongly authenticate the person through both a password and multi-factor token. I'm a little surprised, by the way, that we haven't seen more VPNs starting to use passkey. I have to believe that that's on the horizon. Seems like
Yeah,
a perfect use case.
I'm sure that they're building in support or have and just haven't heard much about it. I would be stunned if that is not on everybody's roadmap, but I've been wrong before.
And then also, obviously, the device authentication. And on top of that, certainly looking for the impossible travel, making sure that you don't have the same person logging in from vastly different locations. A lot of times, by the way, in my experience, because I've worked at places that have had this in the past, we would often see this impossible travel, and what it almost always turned out to be was an employee using a VPN. Like
Sure.
they would have their own personal VPN that they would use to punch an exit node out through some other country. And so, we would have to slap them on the hand and say, don't do that. But certainly it's a good way to detect somebody's account's been all right. Next
Indeed.
story comes from Leaping Computer, and the title here is Microsoft says malvertising campaign impacted 1 million PCs. So I thought this was interesting because yet again, we're seeing GitHub being weaponized as a source of malicious code. And it's relying on the reputation of GitHub. The story here is actually quite simple. We have bad actors who are running a search engine optimization play, trying to advertise, you know, illicit access to movies or software or whatever, pornography, the sky's the limit. And those will take you into kind of a dark world of malicious advertisements that will in turn lead you to a GitHub repository. And they also say that they've seen variants hosted on Dropbox and even Discord. I think most of them, according to the Microsoft report, seem to be hosted on GitHub. And it's not doing anything novel. Like it literally is taking the victim to a GitHub repository and encouraging them to click on the link to download the software and run it.
Yeah, just GitHub. GitHub comes with trust, right? And
Right.
maybe it shouldn't.
And because they know, I think that the trick here is the victims know that they're doing things they shouldn't be. And so I think they probably feel more confident or more comfortable that they have to do something that they wouldn't otherwise do, in addition to the inherent trust that GitHub has. Now, this sounds, by the way, like a very home user centric problem. And I think to some extent it is, but the Microsoft report actually points out that it was across the board. It was enterprise victims, enterprise users were victims, home users, kind of all across the range. And that doesn't necessarily surprise me because I've seen it a lot in my career, people doing some strange stuff on their work computer. Unless you prevent it, it's probably going to happen. What they don't talk about, and I plowed through a bunch of the reports, none of the reports I read indicate what the objective of these attacks was. Now, in all instances, it ends with a remote access Trojan on the workstation. There's multiple steps in between, like they're doing reconnaissance, collecting information about the type of computer, and that helps deliver the right Trojan for that computer. But that's where the reporting stops. And so it's a little unclear, like, does that then get sold, through like a initial access broker? Or what, like that's where the trail ends. But to me is an interesting situation from an enterprise perspective. Yet again, we have this yet another novel way that bad guys have figured out how to weaponize the inherent trust in GitHub to incentivize people to install malware. What I thought was probably the most interesting aspect, and we're starting to see this happening more often. We've talked about this in several recent stories, it's not a situation where like they're coming up with some clever 0 day in a web browser. Like they're just quite literally saying, download this file and run it. And the users are.
Yeah, because free streaming TV or whatever.
Yeah. So you don't block it, they're going to fall for it. There you go.
Yep, they're incentivized.
Anyway, that is any final words on that story?
No, I just think we've got to start educating folks that just because it's on GitHub doesn't mean it can't be hostile. I think there's just this inherent belief that if it's on GitHub, it must be safe, and we know that's not true anymore.
By the way, if you want to read a really interesting technical analysis,
No, I don't. Thanks for offering.
The Microsoft report that's linked from this article is actually a very good read. It's super long and goes through a painstaking breakdown of it, but so I won't go into it any further. We're already way over time.
Yeah, no, I'm good.
All right. That is the show for today. Thank you for 300 amazing episodes, everybody. Hope this is useful to you. If you want to find links to the stories we talked about, you can find them on our website at defensivesecurity.org. Just look for episode 300 and you'll find it. We will also remind you that we do post a video version so you can see Andy and my beautiful face.
I'm sorry.
I'm not.
Look, we're making millions of husbands look better.
Well, it's all part of the service. Exactly. Anyway, you can find me on social media at Jerry at infosec.exchange. Just go to infosec.exchange, create an account, and discover the wonders of the metaverse. And so where can they find you?
I'm also at infosec.exchange at Lerg, L-E-R-G, and also on X at Lerg, L-E-R-G.
Awesome. With that, we will talk again soon. Thanks again to our Patreon donors. I'll put a link to our page in there if anybody would like to donate. We would definitely appreciate that. And we will talk again real soon. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks. Have a great week. Bye-bye.